Good afternoon. I'm Kent Sissel, and I live in the Alexander G. Clark House in Muscatine, Iowa. I've restored the house and live there, and I've spent the past 40 years more or less protecting the legacy of Alexander Clark, who was an equal rights pioneer in the state of Iowa as well as the country. And I was asked by the Honorable Robert Allbee, retired Justice of the Iowa Supreme Court, to visit with him briefly about the early history of Alexander Clark. And this is the Honorable Robert Allbee. To explain a little bit how we really got here and the purpose for all of this.
Thank you. I'm going to borrow this
That's fine.
Letter. I received a letter a month and a half or so ago from the Drake Law School, one of the professors there. He addressed it to all of the current members of the Iowa Supreme Court and as well as former members, indicating that the law school in September intends to have a sesquicentennial celebration of the Iowa Supreme Court's decision in Clark versus the Board of Directors. That decision was in 1868, and it was a landmark decision, and still is a decision, because it the bottom line is that it required the school district to accept an African American, or in those days referred to as either colored or Negro, into the school. It integrated the school about 80-some years before the U.S. Supreme Court had the wisdom to do that in the Brown versus the Board of Education case involving the school district of Wichita, Kansas. So with that in mind, I started researching Alexander Clark a little bit, very interested in the man, the person who might do this, because considering the times and the condition of his race, that was not ordinary, that a person would have the wisdom, the knowledge, or the courage to bring such an action in behalf of his 12-year-old daughter, to require the school district to admit her to an all-white school. And it seemed to me that had to be a remarkable and unusual person. And the more that I've looked into it, the more interesting it's become. And I learned of Mr. Sissel through my research, contacted him, and found that he is a wonderful source of information. And we've decided to talk about that today. And as I've told him, probably I will have more questions than I have answers. But my research on this has been very interesting, and has stimulated additional research. By the way, I have a background in Muscatine County, where I was born in 1928, and I attended rural schools and the Muscatine High School for 2 years before my family moved to western Iowa. But I have many relatives in the Muscatine area, and have had for years, having had a great-great-grandfather who settled in the county in 1856. With that background, I'm going to go back to Mr. Sissel for a moment.
Here's what I thought we would do. I think that what Robert is interested in is the early history of Alexander Clark, and it's something that I have actually done a good deal of research on. I've never spoken about it before. If I have, it's always been genealogically vertical, but what I'm trying to put together at this point is genealogically, horizontally, across multiple families, all of whom were probably involved in the decision of Alexander Clark to come to Muscatine. And I'm going to be really honest with you and say I've never done this before. So I'm pulling information out of the recesses of my brain, which doesn't work as well as it used to. So if I stop and have to let myself think a bit, then you'll have to bear with me. But I thought I would start with Alexander Clark's grandparents, because I think that they play a very important part in the history of Alexander Clark and how he ever had the courage to take on a project, or all the projects that he took on, not only in the United States, not only in Iowa, but in the world. He was extremely well known, as most of us understand at this point. So I'm going to start with his maternal grandparents and tell you what I know about them. And by the way, one of the reasons we're doing this program is so that Mr. Allbee has a copy to take with him so he doesn't have to take notes. And then we've got a copy for the college and for other programs, maybe high school programs here in Muscatine.
Sure.
Alexander Clark was a mulatto. He had white ancestry and black ancestry. I'm going to give you 4 names to begin with. One is George Darnes and his wife Letty or Letici, and those are his maternal grandparents. His paternal grandparents I know very little about, except that I think we can assume that perhaps because of Alexander Clark's name and the naming issue and the process of naming children at that time, he probably was John Clark. He probably lived in Virginia, but Virginia was a very large territory at that point, some of which reached all the way to the Mississippi. Then there are 2 other families that I'll talk about later who had involvement with Alexander Clark. The William Reynolds family and the Drury family. So I'm going to go, then we'll process this a bit and go from there. Alexander Clark was born in 1826 to George Darnes and Letty or Letici Darnes. George Darnes died in 1820 when he was 73, which means he was born before 1750. Letty lived to be 101. She died before 1868, so she would have been born about the same time. Letty had a sister, Penda, who lived to be 103. So there's a very long-lived life in all of these people. George Darnes settled in Washington, Pennsylvania, although it wasn't the borough of Washington at that point, but in Washington County. Prior to the 1800s, he arrived in 1792, 93, 94, and John Clark, Alexander Clark's father, arrived at approximately the same time. The Reynolds family also arrived at about the same time, only a few years earlier. They arrived in the 1780s. So the question is, why did they all go to Washington, Pennsylvania? Washington, Pennsylvania, as I found out by doing research in Washington, was a land grant community. The property had been given to George Washington, and it was distributed to people who fought with him in Brandywine or some other part of the American Revolution. We know that our great-great-great-grandfather fought with George Washington in Brandywine. So he was awarded real estate. It was your reward for fighting the War of Independence. So we've got these families. The other family is the Drury family, but they come later. They were actually Quakers from Philadelphia, or the Philadelphia area. So we've got Alexander Clark's grandfather and his wife arriving in the late 1700s. They had two children that I know of. One was William Darnes, and it's spelled D-A-R-N-S, D-A-R-N-E-S, or other ways.
Yeah.
Because, people didn't know how to spell, or they didn't record things accurately. William was born in 1806. That's Alexander Clark's uncle, who comes into play in Cincinnati.
Cincinnati, yes.
Rebecca was born in 1808. Rebecca is Alexander Clark's mother. And then I'm going to switch to John Clark for a second. John Clark, Alexander Clark's father, seems to have been born about the same time as George Darnes. In 1820, he was 73 years old, which means he probably fought in the Revolution. And it wasn't unusual for black men to fight in the Revolutionary War, because there was a promise of property. And even though the boundaries of Pennsylvania were not determined yet, it probably was appealing. The interesting thing is that John Clark owned a town lot that was very close to George Darnes. So they knew each other. Now I'm going to step back and I'll talk to you a little bit about who George Darnes was. In the family, it is very clear, pardon me, I'm getting older, I need this every once in a while. In the family, Alexander Clark's family, there were several things that appear over and over and over in terms of what they really believed. They believed in education, they believed in their church, they believed in investing in real estate, and they believed in equality. George Darnes, Alexander Clark's grandfather, founded what became the AME Church in Washington, Pennsylvania. And he also founded the black school in Washington, Pennsylvania. In 1820, in a report that I was reading, the black school in Washington, Pennsylvania was considered one of the finest schools in the state. And the same thing happens in each generation of this family. So, having said that, now I'll switch again to John Clark. John Clark was a mulatto. His mother was a mulatto. His father was an Irish farmer, kind-hearted, they say, in some of the biographies. And yet we know nothing about him. So they were all settled in the Washington area around 1790. Now, if you have a question concerning any of that part.
Well, my curiosity is how they became free of slavery, and if anyone knows.
I know that John Clark was freed at birth. He is generally referred to as a slave who was freed later, but because of the miscegenation laws,
Yes.
he and his mother was black.
Oh. Yes.
He would have been freed at birth, and/or John Clark could have been sent to prison. it was absolutely illegal to have any sort of relation with a mulatto or black woman. Now, I need to explain that there are some things that I have been told that seem to be history passed down from generation to generation, and somehow I inherited a lot of that information through Betty Verhusen, whose records I inherited. According to the legend, Alexander Clark's mother continued to live with the Irish farmer. It was a committed relationship. It was only important that Alexander Clark be freed, or the John Clark be freed. And it's quite likely in that freedom he would have been granted some income, so that he had some means of providing for himself. That's all I know about Alexander Clark's paternal family. Although we're fairly certain, based on some drawings that Betty Verhusen had, we're fairly certain that he lived in Virginia. Okay, there's a map. Betty was really good at doing genealogy. The problem is I inherited all of this stuff before I ever had a chance to talk to her, which is unfortunate. I think George Darnes must have been freed. I think Letitia Darnes must have been free. How they were free, I do not know, unless they gained their freedom by fighting in the war.
I read someplace where she was a manumitted slave. In other words, free.
Yeah. I don't understand how that happened.
Yeah, well, they weren't keeping very close records at
Well,
those times.
Pennsylvania actually had a statute that said after so many years, some people had to be freed.
Ah, okay.
But that legislation continued much after they moved here.
Most of my information is much more sparse than what you've just related, but that I understood he was in Pennsylvania with family, and that he had available a pretty decent schooling.
Right.
But that, and I'm not sure about what age, but at 11 or 13, I'm not certain which, he apparently went or was sent to Cincinnati to be with the uncle you referred to.
William Darnes.
Yes.
He left when he was 13, and everybody thought that he got more education there, and maybe he did. William Darnes' two daughters attended Oberlin College.
Oh, yes.
William Darnes moved to Cincinnati from Pittsburgh, where he was known as a fairly wealthy real estate investor. I'm going to backstep just a second. In the tax records of Washington, Pennsylvania, 1820, George Darnes had died in that year, and the tax records indicated that Letitia Darnes paid the tax, and someone in the margin of her entry in the tax rolls in pencil writes mansion. I don't know what that means, unless she had a fairly large house.
Mm. Yeah. Okay.
I think George Darnes probably had acquired some wealth, and there was a Supreme Court case in Washington or in Pennsylvania because Letitia didn't want to pay a debt that George had incurred. So it went to the Supreme Court, and she was told she had to pay it, so she did. But she was trying to avoid the payment. So we've got William Darnes, who perhaps has some money. He believed in philanthropy. We've got William Darnes, who is known as a philanthropist in Cincinnati, extremely well known for that. And at the age of 13, Alexander Clark goes to Cincinnati to be with his uncle. It probably, William Darnes was in fact a barber, along with his real estate investments. This is what happens when you get older and you talk too much.
Well, I'm familiar with the barbering background. I shouldn't say familiar, but I have read about it, and that he learned barbering from an uncle in Cedar in Cincinnati, and apparently he was there until about age 19.
He left when he was about 16.
Oh, that much earlier.
15, or he wasn't really in Cincinnati very long.
Oh.
And I suspect he left Cincinnati because of the race uprisings, the race wars that existed in Cincinnati around that time. And he boarded a steamer ship.
Yes.
Curiously enough, called the George Washington.
Yeah. I thought that was ironic.
and traveled to traveled up and down the river.
Yes.
From Cincinnati to New Orleans, and he was a bartender. How he learned that trade, since he didn't believe in alcohol, I'm not quite sure, but I think he made considerable money through tips.
He would have been traveling up and down the Ohio River and the Mississippi.
And the Mississippi.
And the Mississippi is probably what led him to Muscatine, which I believe at that time was still Bloomfield.
I'm going to add something into all of that.
Please.
Now let's go back to the Reynolds family.
Okay.
The Reynolds family from Washington, Pennsylvania, moved from Washington, Pennsylvania to, I think it's Wright County, Ohio, which is right outside of Cincinnati. And eventually moved into the Muscatine area. Actually, they lived directly across the river in Drury Township.
Oh,
Okay. And this is where the names get confusing. Reynolds Drury was the founder of Drury's Landing, which was the center of commerce and shipping along the Mississippi to the north. There are reports in the various histories that have been written that he had sufficient capital, that he had accounts in all of the major cities along the Mississippi, Cincinnati, St. Louis, and New Orleans, so that he could ship and receive goods to be used to bring to Muscatine or to go west. Drury Reynolds and the Reynolds family were known in Cincinnati. So I'm going to leave that alone for a second. The Reynolds family came into this area in about 1836. 3 siblings of the Reynolds family married 3 siblings of the Drury family, all Quaker. And they came here because of the military grants. The road that, when you go over the bridge in Muscatine, that road is the dividing line between military grant properties and properties you have to buy. Reynolds Drury bought the property for Drury's Landing, but all of the members of the Drurys and the Reynolds had huge farms on the other side of the road. Drury's Landing, if you know Muscatine or the Muscatine area, Drury's Landing was directly across the river from Geneva, a little town just north of Muscatine on Highway 22. Dr. Eli Reynolds was the founder of Geneva. Drury Reynolds was the founder of Drury's Landing. There was a ferry that went back and forth. Geneva was supposed to have been the county seat, but Governor Kirkwood didn't sign the bill in time, so Muscatine became the county seat. Where do I want to go with that? Because I'll probably come back to this. But eventually where I'm going to get is that according to the family history that has been passed down within black families, when Alexander Clark came to Muscatine, he lived with Dr. Eli Reynolds in Drury's Landing. And when Alexander Clark first came to Muscatine, he operated a dried foods shop on 2nd Street in Muscatine. The only place he could have gotten the produce that he was selling would have been from Drury Reynolds. Drury Reynolds, insofar as I can figure out, was a nephew of Dr. Eli Reynolds. Dr. Eli Reynolds had been a medic in the War of 1812 and had probably, he was also the founder of New Boston, Illinois. New Boston, Illinois was surveyed by a young surveyor by the name of Abraham Lincoln. The families, where I'm headed with all of this is Alexander Clark was extremely well connected. He had financial power, he had association power, he had educational power, and it made it possible for him to come to Iowa, perhaps at the recommendation of his uncle, because Iowa was a free state to pursue equal rights. I think this was programmed. I really do. I even think that the Susan Clark case was programmed. If you start looking at the people who were involved in that case, especially at the state level or even the local level, they knew each other. And they were all relatively liberal people. So now I got to go back to my notes and see what I was doing. Iowa was essentially a free state with the Supreme Court, the territorial Supreme Court decision in Ralph in 1839. Right. And one of the justices was Judge Joseph Williams.
From Muscatine.
From Muscatine, and Alexander Clark's neighbor. Alexander Clark, when he came to Muscatine, and I'm not sure where he lived initially, but eventually he bought a house. He moved into the neighborhood of Chestnut and West 3rd. That was a highly influential neighborhood. Across the house that Alexander Clark bought in 1848 had been the residence of one of the early presidents of the Corporation of Muscatine, essentially a mayor. The house directly across the street was the home of D.P. Johnson, Dr. D.P. Johnson, who had been a surgeon during the Civil War and had also served as president of the Muscatine Corporation. Judge Joseph Williams lived directly across the street on Chestnut. He was an early president of the Muscatine Corporation. The property in that area had belonged to Isaiah Drury. So all of these people and their religious beliefs and their political beliefs seemed to intertwine into this phenomenal situation that made it possible for Alexander Clark to accomplish what he did.
It's my understanding that he did serve as a barber, that he was prudent with his income and invested in timberland, and that, among other things, he chopped or cut wood that he sold to steamship companies. At least that's what I've read.
That is part of the story. When Alexander Clark first came here, I don't think that he was a barber, because Thomas Motts, who was a black man and a barber, extremely well known, was already in business here, and the population wasn't that great. I think what happened after Alexander Clark decided to no longer sell dried fruits, he started selling logs, timber, to the riverboat traffic. Now we go back to that history that's been passed down from generation to generation. He didn't sell wood to the steamboats in Muscatine. He sold wood to the steamboats in Drury Landing. Okay. And the reason for that is Drury's Landing had a pier that extended out into the river, so that steamboats, whether they were going up the river or down the river, didn't have to back in, turn around. They could simply do the safest thing, which was tie off to the pier, and they could load wood. The biggest problem with steamboats during that period of time was that if you're coming either downriver or upriver, and you pulled into the landing in Muscatine, you have to use every bit of power that your boiler can possibly manufacture to get back out into the river. Boilers blew up. Besides, there were all sorts of materials and supplies being delivered to Drury's Landing to be brought back to Muscatine over the ferry. That lasted until 1866. The river flooded and wiped the whole town away. And actually, we're lucky enough in Muscatine to have photographs of Drury's Landing after it was flooded. And drawings done by John McGreer, who was the stepson of Dr. Charles Drury, who was Dr. Eli Reynolds' nephew, showing what the town looked like and what Muscatine looked like. It's a small family.
My impression from what I've also researched is that, as I said, he was prudent, that he invested in property.
Yes.
And among other things, he was a delegate to the 1856 Constitutional Convention, where the Iowa Constitution had some revisions and changes. And then a year or so later, about 1849, he and others, he was a founder of the American Methodist Church.
The African American.
African American
AME.
Church. Yeah, it was a black church.
Yes.
In Muscatine.
Yes.
And a very active person in that congregation as far as a supporter, a teacher, a parishioner.
And they founded one of the black schools.
And in fact, that's where his daughter attended school until this lawsuit was commenced.
I believe that's correct.
That's the impression I've drawn from what I've read.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I don't know that we have any evidence that says it was anything else. Okay. Except there is also some sort of a question about whether there was one black school or whether there were two black schools. We're fairly certain that Alexander Clark paid for the teacher for that school, especially the one that was on 7th Street here in Muscatine. And even in his probate records, he was still making a $500 a year stipend to a teacher.
Oh, nice.
I think he was very generous.
Yes.
was a very generous man. But he I think, had money. He made a great deal of money, and he spent it where he thought it would do the best good. Okay, let me pass on a couple other things, and this is later on in Alexander Clark's life. I mentioned Abraham Lincoln as a friend or an acquaintance of Dr. Eli Reynolds. When Alexander Clark traveled to London on several occaasions.
And that was a part of a Masonic organization, wasn't it?
That was part of a Masonic organization. He was Grand Master for the Prince Hall Masonic Temple, Missouri organization, which included Missouri, Tennessee, Wisconsin, Iowa, Alabama. And he traveled up and down the river visiting Masonic organizations, but that also gave him contacts so that during the Civil War, he could recruit free black men as well as runaway slaves to Iowa to fight in the first Iowa.
And that would help meet the Iowa quota that Lincoln had asked for as far as providing troops.
Yes. Yeah. So I think he was a miraculous man. And what I was going to mention to you is when Alexander Clark accepted the position to go to Monrovia, Liberia, the first thing he did when he got to London was visit Robert Lincoln.
Oh, the oldest son of Abraham.
Yes, yes. So it's a small group of people all working together.
Interestingly, he was also a delegate to some national Republican conventions.
Correct.
First as he wasn't attached to any particular district at that time.
No.
He was also known as quite an orator.
He was the colored orator of the West.
Of the prairie, the orator of the prairie and the colored orator of the West, yes. Now you mentioned going to London and so on. All of those things were, were they after the litigation or on both sides of it? It doesn't really matter.
I think they were on both sides.
Yes.
I think they were on both sides.
Now
because he would have gone to visit Robert Lincoln when he was on his way to Liberia in 89 or 90.
Now the litigation itself is something that, of course, is of interest to this seminar at the law school. And I have copied and examined, of course, once again, the Clark case and the Iowa reports. I was interested in the local lawyers, if you know them or anything about them, because the reports of the case itself indicate who handled the appeals. Mm-hmm. And there were four justices of the Supreme Court at the time, and the majority of 3. But we have here William F. Brannan for the appellants, that would be the school board, mm-hmm. and Richmond and Carscadden, and Henry O'Connor
Correct.
for the Allebee, or the
All from Muscatine.
all from Muscatine. Now, were they or some of them also the trial lawyers? Or do
Yes.
you know?
Yes. The district court?
Yes.
I'm going to forget one of the Richmond's names, but the judge for the district court was a Richmond. And the attorney who presented the case before the district court was a Richmond. They were brothers.
And he was working then with, I see the Richmond, of counsel here.
Jerome Carskadden was Alexander Clark's lifelong attorney. All of these people just lived up the hill a little bit. And Henry O'Connor later went on to become Attorney General the next year.
Oh, yeah, okay, yes.
So that's way too much connection to be coincidental.
Well, and there's way too much connection than we would accept today.
Without a doubt.
Another thing about this that's of great interest to Drake University and the law school is the fact that the person, Cole, who wrote the decision for the majority, was really a founder of the Drake Law School.
Right.
As a matter of fact, his name was interesting. It was Chester Cicero Cole.
Huh. Was it Cole or Co? C-O-E?
Cole, C-O-L-E, C-O-L-E, yes.
Cole, okay.
And as I said, he was the author of the decision, which was joined in by two other justices, Justice Beck. I think he was from one of the southern Iowa cities, and Dillon was the Chief Justice. And the dissent was by a justice named Brannon, as I recall, who was well regarded. And no, pardon me, this was Justice Wright.
George S. Wright. George Sylvester Wright.
Yes, and he was also worked with Cole in the founding of an Iowa law school.
And in 1871, Wright was serving as, I guess, a representative in Congress.
I'm not sure about that.
But he was either a senator or a representative in Congress and recommended Alexander Clark for diplomatic position.
Ah, okay, then that was during President U.S. Grant's time.
Yeah, right.
Because it was Grant who offered one position that he didn't feel was enough.
There wasn't enough money.
It wasn't enough financial reward, and then he was offered the second one sometime later.
Right.
Of course, Grant had appeared in Iowa and in Des Moines during this time and made quite an impression here, and I think became acquainted with Clark, at least, if not before, during that time.
As I remember, Alexander Clark was one of the people elected to call on Grant when he was elected to give congratulations from the state of Iowa.
Oh, okay. So there was a prior meeting then, a prior connection. Yeah, there's a lot of intertwining.
It's all conflict of interest today.
Yeah, or at least the appearance.
The appearance.
Yes.
The appearance of.
One of the things that, of course, isn't generally known unless you've been interested in the man is the fact that his daughter did attend school and did finish at Muscatine High School throughout, that he had a younger son who was the first black person admitted to the University of Iowa Law School.
Correct.
Of which he became a graduate. By the way, the law school at that time was one year of study. And that then Alexander Clark himself went to law school when he was about 57 or something,
Right.
56 or 57, and apparently from some things I've read was really quite popular among the students.
My understanding is that the University of Iowa Special Collections has a number of articles that Alexander Clark wrote
During that time.
during the time he was a student, and he was very popular.
I've read someplace, you always wonder about the authorities on which they're based, but that his class, it was again still 1 year, had 80 students, and he stood 8th in
Right.
in the academic standings of the class. And then it was after that he took. It wasn't an ambassadorship; it was called something else, but
Consul General and Resident Minister
to Liberia.
to Monrovia, Liberia.
Of course, Liberia historically was founded and populated by former American slaves.
That's correct.
And Monrovia was named for President Monroe.
Liberia for liberty.
And okay, thank you. Yes. So Alexander Clark, the person, the man that interested me, was quite an intelligent, resourceful, prudent in his conduct. He was just some person, I think, destined to succeed. Now, there's no question in my mind that this background of which you told us about aided him, or made it possible probably, because of being...
Certainly made it easier for him.
Yeah.
But I think he was a driven individual.
Well, but it gave him the facilities.
Right, right.
The educational facilities, the opportunities of which he took advantage.
One of the things we shouldn't forget is that Alexander Clark did not remarry after his wife died. He married Catherine Griffin in 1849, and she was. He met her in Iowa City.
Yes.
And she supposedly was free, but she was not necessarily emancipated, because the two sisters owned her, and they would not sign the papers to grant her full freedom. Catherine died in 1849, 30 years later, when the Alexander Clark House, the original Alexander Clark House, was set afire.
Yeah.
And we know very little of Catherine, but there is no doubt that she had influence over what Alexander Sr. did.
I read somewhere in my searching here that she was a part Indian. Is there any authority for that?
I don't know that. Yeah, I don't know that.
Okay. Well, those things pop into history sometimes.
I know.
Gratuitously.
Well, yes. There's lots of things that pop into it. That's why I try to be careful about what I can actually document and what I have heard.
I'm testing my knowledge today, not saying that it's all authentic, but also he had associations with other well-known black leaders as time went on.
Yes, like Frederick Douglass.
Frederick Douglass was the most notable.
And he had been a friend of Frederick Douglass's for about, we say, between 40 to 50 years before Alexander Clark was appointed as Consul General, Resident Minister to Monrovia. And that position came about. They first met at a national conference in Washington, D.C. in
That was my understanding. He'd met someplace.
Yeah, and they had visited a number of times, but in 1889, Alexander Clark was visiting Frederick Douglass at his home in Washington, D.C. And that's when, President Harrison was there as well.
Oh, yeah, it'd be Benjamin Harrison.
Right. And Alexander Clark.
That would be before the Civil War then.
No, it was later.
Benjamin was later? Okay.
He appointed Alexander Clark to Monrovia.
That's right. I should have remembered that. Yes.
There was an article in a Chicago newspaper. The newspaper was called the Inter-Ocean, and it announced that Frederick Douglass was being, I have never seen the article, but I think it said it announced that he was being appointed to the position in Haiti that Alexander Clark had turned down long before. And Alexander Clark wrote Frederick Douglass a letter saying, hey guy, remember that when I was there with you, and he called him Harris, not Harrison, but Harris, you said that if you got this job, you'd recommend me for the position of Recorder of Deeds for Washington, D.C. I found an article that said that he was, in fact, appointed to that position, but I don't think he ever served because he was immediately appointed to Monrovia.
One other item there that I had given some call to my attention was the fact that he and perhaps his son too purchased and operated for a period of time a newspaper in the Chicago area.
The Conservator.
Okay.
Alexander Clark purchased it, and I'd have to go back and look up the names.
It would. I know it was at a time after the Clark.
It was about 1883.
All right.
And when it sold, Barnett. Who am I thinking of? Ferdinand Barnett, who was associated with Ida B. Wells. They took the newspaper over when Alexander Clark decided to dispose of it. But he was owner publisher.
Did they move into the Chicago area for a while?
Yes.
All right.
Yes. Because his I don't know much about that period of Alexander Clark's life, and it's difficult to find much history on it. I know that Alexander Clark's granddaughter, Clara Lieber Jones, lived in Chicago, and Susan Clark died in Chicago with her niece.
Yes, I've seen. I have a copy of a long statement that she gave of her history of Susan Clark's.
Really?
Yes. I'm not sure. I think it was with the library material that I got from the Musser Library here in Muscatine.
Huh.
And if you don't have it, well, I'll make sure that you get a copy.
I don't know. I do. I'd like to have that. Yes. Yeah.
And let's see the date of it. She says that Susan Clark, and so on, the daughter of the nation's foremost black citizens. This affidavit it's really more than an affidavit. It's almost a deposition-like. I thought I had a date, but I don't. Well, I can't find it now. But she was obviously an adult, and I think living in Chicago at the time.
So that would have been Clara. Clara was the daughter of Rebecca Clark and George Appleton. He was a barber who probably managed Alexander Clark's barber shop.
Okay. Let's see. Well,
And there was another daughter, Mabel Appleton, whose married name was White, and we believe that is Jim White
yes.
of the famous Jim White case, which we don't even have time to talk about.
No, and there was even legend that Jim White was a part of Huckleberry Finn.
Yes.
Well, so we don't exhaust everyone, I've been very appreciative of
Thank
the
you. Oh,
opportunity.
I've enjoyed it. It's been
And
fun.
as I said, I had more questions than I had answers, and I try to be a good listener. You learn more that way. And your assignment here of material that you have.
This is a booklet of materials that I put together dealing with the Jim White case.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah, but it has I've got Susan Clark's obituary. I stuff things into books.
Yes.
It's got Susan Clark's obituary, and it's got Rebecca's obituary, and there are other materials here.
Well, I'm very grateful.
I'll pass on just a couple other things,
Yes.
because sometimes there is the cemetery stone, where Alexander Clark and Catherine are buried at Greenwood Cemetery, has some of the names of the family. And Alexander Clark Jr., who lived in Oskaloosa,
Yes.
is buried at the cemetery there. They died during a period of time, it seems to me, based on what I know, where they were not anxious to have any notoriety.
Okay.
Alexander Jr. and his wife were buried in unmarked graves.
Were they fearful of people doing destructive things?
I think they were tired of all the discrimination.
Yes.
Susan Clark and her husband, Richard Holly, Reverend Holly, are buried at Greenwood Cemetery. Their names are not on the stone.
Yeah. Well, that's sad.
It is very sad.
Yeah.
It is very sad. But I think that I don't know much about Susan, but I think probably she was overwhelmed with this Susan Clark case.
Well, it's a final note here. My understanding is that you reside in the home that
I do.
That Mr. Clark, Alexander Clark, built following some arson to his other home, or the
Yes.
predecessor home.
Yeah. The unfortunate thing of all of that is I suspect Alexander Clark kept very careful journals. Everything was destroyed and lost in the fire.
Yeah. Yeah.
I wish we had that. I think we'd learn a lot.
Yes.
So this has been great fun. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you
so much.
I hope we can talk again.
Pleasure.
Maybe I'll see you at the Drake Symposium.
Well, you certainly would be welcome.
I want to talk to you about that. I'm not sure exactly what the dates are, but I'm sure I'm going to find those out later.
I have information.
Okay. So thank you. I think we have accomplished what we hope to do, and I think we've kept it under time. Enjoy. It's just another piece of history, another piece of Muscatine history. I hope you find it fascinating. I've enjoyed every minute of it. Thank you.